amenable to so many interpretations. And as a writer, one should never attempt to interpret or talk about her or his own work. So let me start with some facts about myself. I'm a Kannada writer, I write in Kannada, but my mother tongue is Konkani. I grew up in a small village, small town near Goa in coastal Karnataka, just south of Karwar. Most of my childhood years were spent there. And you can imagine in those days, not like today, there was no TV nor any other distractions nor temptations for children to spend their time. And most of my time was spent with books, but time was spent with books without, I must say I started reading without understanding what it is. As I said, my mother tongue is Konkani. My grandfather was a teacher, so he taught me to read and write Kannada at a very young age. So in a language like Kannada, which is a phonetic language, if you know the alphabets, you can read and write, but you may not understand it. So I was taught at a very early age. When I was 4, I knew how to read and write, but I had very little exposure outside, and hence Kannada was not something that I could easily understand. However, I started reading, and then I still remember reading Chandamamas and books of that kind, and then not understanding a particular word, and then waiting for my grandfather to come and tell me the meaning of the word. And I found it very fascinating because you read something and then you don't understand a few things, a word or two, and then you start imagining what it could be. And that became a kind of a game between me and my grandfather, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. And I feel that it was a kind of a joy that I found, and also some kind of a training to my mind that how a particular word placed in a sentence could alter the meaning of a sentence. And that was very fascinating. At the same time, there were other things that were happening. My place is, as I said, was a small town in coastal Karnataka, and a theatre form called Yakshagana was very popular. It is still popular. It is something very similar to Kathakali, but there is conversation. And this form is something where the costumes are different. They pick up stories from these two epics, Ramayana and Mahabharata, and then it is played out all night. It starts around 10 o'clock in the night and goes on till 6 in the morning. And the costume is very similar to what you see in Kathakali, and the kings and all those characters from these two epics. And I was very much interested in this because my father was interested in it, and he took me wherever he went. And in my childhood, I have seen hundreds of them. Literally, till I was 17 years old, I was so fascinated by this art that at some point in time, I wanted to become a Yakshagana artist. The beauty of this art is As I said, it starts around 10 o'clock in the night, and the stage is about 20 by 20, or might be even slightly smaller. And there are people who are sitting at the back who sing so that they take the story forward. But the characters, after that song of maybe 2, 3, 4 minutes, then they speak and there's a conversation, but that dialogue is extempore. It is not a written dialogue, which means that every time that play is performed, that particular story is performed, even with the same artist, it gives you a different experience. And with different artists, needless to say how different it will be. And something very unique to this is what I was impressed with and what influenced me greatly is that when in a story, for example, if there is a story of Karna and Arjuna and Karna dying, after Karna's body is inflicted with so many wounds and arrows and then he's about to die, then there is a conversation that goes on for 3 hours. So it is, that real, unreal art, story, the connection between them, because the people who are singing, sitting in a normal clothes and sipping tea at the back, you can see them with the drums and singing and all this, while there is people with these costumes who play out this particular story, and we imagine them when they explain in their words that this is a court of Indra, and it is up to us to imagine, the power of the words. And then this one, where they pick up one moment in the life of, for example, in the life of Karna, at that moment when he is dying, and that one moment is picked up to have that conversation and discussion, to look at his entire life. And something, something more, and so on and so forth, the philosophy of it and whatnot. And this, I just give you an example, but this something like this happens all through, and the story is not important. What is really important is this experience. And these artists, they read a lot, they train themselves to perform these roles. For example, there is one, I remember a moment in Ravana Vadha where Mandodari asks Ravana, were you really attracted to Sita? And that particular conversation goes on for hours, and then it explores all kinds of things. What is life? What is a marriage? And what is a relationship? What is infatuation? What is attraction? They just get into various levels of exploring aspects of that particular story. And this is something that I feel when I look back is something that influenced me greatly. I mean, of course, when one talks about these things, one is not aware what is happening to us or to me when I was undergoing it. Now, with the benefit of hindsight, I assume and I think that this is what would have happened. The other thing was, as I said, there was very little for me to do in my childhood. And since I knew how to read, there were 4 books in my house. And those 4 books were that of Krishnavatara. And which much later I realized they were translations of K.M. Munshi's book into Kannada. Somebody had presented that to me. And that gift was very invaluable. But the thing is, those are the only 4 books. And how much can one read? So I read them and reread them. And that is, I feel there is some joy and some beauty in reading the same thing again and again and again. There was joy in this, watching the same Yakshagana again, because there is something, slightly different there. And even when you read, I discovered that with every reading, it is the same thing, it is the same book, it's the same printed text. But then there is something that revealed, something new every time you read it. And I was very fascinated by it because it was, I mean, I did it because it was inevitable, that there was no other choice. But then there is something, I mean, I'm sure all of us have read and reread books in our lives. And that every time that new reading gives a different experience. But, and I feel that there is some beauty in reading the same thing, knowing the same thing again and again. And I remember I had my grandfather's sister. I used to pester everybody to tell me stories. And she was the one who was very kind, and she is the one who told me stories all the time. But uh, she told the same story always. And but she was such a marvelous storyteller that every time I felt it is different. Because wherever she was, she would start with a story. If she was in the kitchen, she would start with a story in the kitchen. And something, once my sister had broken her leg, and the hero of the story, his sister also had broken her leg. Something like this. She would connect something and weave the story. I don't know how many, maybe 50, 100 times, or maybe more than that, she has told me this story. But it is the same story which every time probably she knew the same story, but I did not think that it was the same story. So these are some of the things that have, influenced my mind and influenced my years of growing up. And in a small place, it's a very lonely, not lonely. I mean, I didn't know the word lonely at that time, but it's a very, what would I say? Yeah, kind of lonely growing up in those days. So it was, in a way, it was really good that I could spend my time with Yakshagana and books and so on and so forth. And that habit of reading grew. And at the age of 15, 16, I started writing. I must also talk about some kind of influences that I had when I started writing. Uh, I used to read a lot, and then I started writing. I published a couple of stories. And then I came across a writer called Yashwant Chittal, who is also from the same place as I come from. And he is, he is no more. He was a very great writer, Kannada writer. I have dedicated my book Gachar Gochar to him, the English edition of it. So he was and I read his stories, and I read his few early collections of stories. And they were all stories set in and around the place where I was living. And I was so surprised because in my mind in those days that to become a writer, one has to travel the world, one has to go and see, experience great things. I didn't know what those great things were. But at that young age, you have that imagination. You feel that you have to experience something different and something big to be a writer. And here is a writer who is such a great writer, and his stories were all something that were happening in and around that village and a small place. So he created a village called Hanehalli, which appears in all his works, his stories and novels, and it's something similar to Yokna Patavpa of Faulkner. So this one place which is center of the world for him. And even though he wrote about Bombay, he moved to Bombay later on, that this village appeared in all of his stories. So that was a kind of a location from where he viewed the world, or that was a kind of a yardstick for him. So I read him, and then I was very impressed and influenced, because at that age you get something very ready-made, and it's so easy to write like someone else because there is a structure, there is a language. And also for me, his mother tongue was also Konkani, and he wrote in Kannada. So some of the expressions, it was so easy to get into his skin and write. In the meanwhile, I wrote to him as a young writer and saying I admire his work. And he said he is coming to visit his village. And in those days, he used to live in Bombay. He always lived in Bombay. And he said he will take me to his village. And I was very thrilled. He came and he took me in his car and I visited him. And he has, as I said, most of his stories were based in that village, at least the early stories. And there is a famous story called Abolin. Abolin is the name of a girl. And the story goes like this. It is a girl who is so innocent that a crook in the village convinces her that he takes her to a temple nearby, he kisses her and tells her that now that I have kissed you, you have become pregnant. And this girl doesn't have, her mother is no more, and her father is looking after her. And this girl, so innocent, a 15-year-old girl, she believes in it. And then finally, he goes to the church, confesses, saying that I have done this crime, and this is what has happened. And I am willing to take any punishment. And the father of the church is, he asked for Abolin's father, and and the whole thing is done by this crook to marry this young, beautiful girl. And after that meeting, the father agrees to marry Abolina to this crook, and he comes out of the church, with such heavy heart, and comes down that steps. So in my imagination, that those steps and his walk was like unending steps. Those and that church and the way it was described. So it was. I was very eager to see this location because Abolina is a very famous story of this writer. So we went there. Similarly, there is another story by Yashwant Chittal. In that story, an old man walks from one end of the village to the other end of the village, and in a night, and the story is about death. And as he walks, it is a rainy night. As he walks, he only sees the path when there is a lightning. So just as there is lightning, the things get described in the story, and that's how he goes through. And it looks like as if he has walked such a long distance. And when I go there, and he showed me the church where Abolina's father had gone, and he had come down those steps. And I was so disappointed because the church was not even 8 feet. I mean, it was a small little building. And the steps there were only 3 steps. And that road that he had taken, which looked like an eternal journey, was hardly 2 furlongs. But it taught me something very, very important. I mean, what is life? What is reality? And what is reality in literature? What is real time and what is, literary time? And that I will never forget because it was, I could see it and he was seeing it. I was not seeing it. He was saying, look, this is the church and this is the thing and this is the road. But there is something I realized that transformation is absolutely essential for literature. What you see and what you perceive and what it becomes, it is something, and at that young age, I think it was a great lesson that I learned, a practical lesson which was in front of me. And I'm so grateful to Chittal for, letting me experience it. Now, as I said, I was so greatly influenced, I started writing like him. When I wrote, I think it was probably my 3rd or 4th story, it was published in a magazine, and the editor once told me that he was in praise of the story, but he also added a sentence. He said that you write like Chittal, and I like it very much. And I was very much alarmed because suddenly that you find, I was 17, 18, 19, and suddenly I found that I obviously didn't want to write like him. But that influence was so strong that unknowingly I had started writing like him. And then I decided that I must come out of this influence. And I started working on the text of my stories and consciously removed everything that resembled anything and everything that Chital wrote. And in that process, I discovered myself. Because it is, if you know what you don't want to write, it is you, in the process, you discover what you really want to write. And Chital, all through his life, I admired him, honored him, and he was always, and for my first collection, he wrote a foreword. So he has always remained a guide and a senior writer for me. So and from my town, I moved on. I went to do my engineering, and which changed my world completely because that exposure that I got from coming from a village to become an engineer was something that was fantastic. And then as part of my job, I moved to various parts of the country, and I lived and worked in Calcutta and then in the US and in London and so on and so forth. But when I wrote a story in 1992, which is when our country was just getting exposed to globalization, which is when I realized the challenges of writing about this new experience. Because I feel as a writer that there are two phases in our country in the last 50 years. One is before globalization and one is after globalization. And so many things that we see today, whether it's development of all kinds, including right wing, has roots in those years of globalization. People were living differently, the ideology was different, the relationships were different, everything was different before 92 and then on. And at that time I wrote a story, and it was in English, it was called the Riding the Tiger. I wrote the story in Kannada, obviously. But after I wrote the story is set in a corporate world, in a training center of a corporate house, and at the background was a corporate game. So a few people were being trained to operate in a globalized world, and they were asked to take almost real-time decisions, but it was a game. And then some of them don't like it, so they resist, and so on and so forth. So basically the story was this. And when I wrote it in Kannada, it was so challenging because the kind of experience that I was trying to capture, it was not there in Kannada. There were equivalent words in Kannada, but they were so harsh to ears. So the story read almost like a bad translation. And I struggled with it because then that's when I realized how difficult it is to bring an experience which does not happen in that language, which is happening somewhere else, in some other language, in some other world, and how to bring that in. And today, after 30 years, I don't think we have come so much far. And Kannada also has absorbed so many of these experiences and so many of this. But the challenge remains still there, in the sense that what I had written probably would have been, I can probably write in a more effective way, but there are new challenges, the new challenges of new experiences, the experiences that does not happen in our own language, and how to deal with it. So these kind of experiences and challenges I have always had throughout my career. And it gave me a kind of limitations about my own style, my own language, and how to deal with that. Let me, since I have 20 minutes more, I will read a bit of from my novel, which is Ghachar Gochar. It's also available in Malayalam, published by DC Books. Let me read a paragraph, and then maybe I can keep some 5-7 minutes for questions, if any, in the end. This is a scene where the ants have invaded the house, and the narrator is talking about it. We had two types of ants at home. One was a small, brisk moving black variety that appeared only occasionally. But when it did, it came in an army numbering thousands. These ants entered the house in orderly columns, then began to wander everywhere in apparent confusion, always bumping heads and pausing before realizing something and rushing off in random directions. They had no they had no discernible purpose in life other than trying our patience. It didn't seem like they were here to find food, nor did they make the effort to bite anyone. Left to themselves, they would quickly howl in particles of mud, and build nests here and there in the house. You could try scuttling them with a broom, but they would get into a mad frenzy and climb up the broom and onto your arm. Before you knew it, they would be all over you, even under your clothes. For days on end, there would be a terrific invasion, and then one day you would wake up to find them gone. There was no telling why they came, where they went. I sometimes saw them racing in lines along the window sill in the front room, where there was nothing to eat. Perhaps they were on a mission of some sort, only passing through our house in self important columns. But not once did I see the tail of a column, an ant that had no other ants behind it. The other type of ant was a brown variety with more intelligence. These weren't particularly fast, but they had about them a clarity, a sense of purpose. You never found them rushing about aimlessly, killing time. But if there was as much as a speck of food to be had, they would somehow find out, turn up in orderly lines, and with great concentration, haul bits of food out through a corner of the window or into a hole in the floor we had never noticed before. These ants could arrive, these ants could drive Amma mad. She could not stand the knowledge that everything we were eating had first been tasted by ants. She took to creating a around whatever she cooked, placing the vessel in a large plate with water in it. Even then, some of the ants would try to swim across and perish in the process. The slightest lapse on our part, a box with a lid that wasn't shut right, a serving spoon lying unwashed, immediately came to the attention of these ants. If a single grain of rice dropped outside the plate, you would see ants deliberating its transportation before you rose from your meal. If one of us carried a snack out of the middle room, ants would carry away crumbs we hadn't even realized we had dropped. They would gather around rings left by teacups on the floor. A mortar used to make chutney and washed a little casually, ants. Coconut grated and shell left lying around for a minute, ants to finish off any remaining specks. Charred flakes around the edge of the dosa pan, within no time, ants. Amma was obsessive about washing vessels. She would scrub vessels clean immediately after she finished cooking. Malati and I were trained to wash cups and plates as soon as we were done with them. Looking back, it's possible all this had nothing to do with the cleanliness and was simply part of Amma's struggle against the ant. Amma resorted to chemical warfare, all sorts of powders and poisons. She made a dough from flour and gamaxin powder and sealed cavities behind which the ants were suspected of having their hideouts. Whether this killed any ants or not, it at least prevented Amma from feeling entirely powerless. The rest of us too were hardened by strife. it became a reflex to reach out and squash a stray passing ant. On someone's advice, Amma started treating the house with neem smoke. An old tin box was reserved for the purpose. About once a week, burning coals would be tipped into it over a base of sand and handfuls of neem leaves thrown in. It produced thick smoke. Amma covered her nose and mouth with the end of her sari and took the fuming box around the house, letting it linger in corners and behind the cupboard. Once I woke up in the middle of the night to go to the toilet and found Amma in the kitchen. She was on her haunches, facing the wall, tracing the path of a line of ants using a flashlight. Now, unlike rats and cats, ants don't make things fall in the night and wake people up. I can only imagine the clamor they must have created in her mind. At one stage, she even went around meeting officials and got the corporation to fog the neighborhood. It's impossible to say whether it made a difference. We still had ants. We had no compunction towards our enemies and took to increasingly desperate and violent means of dealing with them. We, had, we would flatten them with our hands or feet or books wherever we saw them. If we noticed that they had laid siege to a snack, we might trap them in a circle drawn with water and take away whatever they were eating. Then watch them scurry about in confusion before wiping them off with a wet cloth. I took pleasure in seeing them shrivel into black points when burning coals were rolled over a group of them. When they attacked an unwashed vessel or a cup, they would soon be mercilessly drowned. I suppose initially we did these things only when we were alone, but in time we began to be openly cruel to ants. We saw them as demons come to swallow our home and became a family that took satisfaction in the destruction of ants. We might have changed houses since, but habits are harder to change. We have 10 minutes. I can take questions if any. The translation is something that taught me a lot as a writer. As I said, I was working and then I gave up my job a few years ago to be a full-time writer, and which is when I started looking at my translations. So as a fiction writer, it is when you see your work getting translated into another language, it tells you a lot of things about our own style, the way we write, and the limitations of our style mainly, and the language. Because some of the things that sound so profound in our original language, in translation they read so silly. So what is built with all these clutches of language, and what we assume as a writer, we take so many things for granted because we write in a language, we write in a culture, we write in certain ethos, and the moment you cross that gate of translation, nothing comes to your help. So suddenly it's a different text, it's a different language, and the experience of that working with my translator has given me immense insight into looking at my writing, looking at my text in a different way. Not that it has impacted my writing, but it has made me aware of certain things which I was not aware earlier.
Since you talked about translation, I'm also interested about your self-translation, like your editing process. Because you have written your editing process, especially because you write such succinct prose, where every line carries a lot of information within it. And okay, the works that I have read, like Sakina's Kiss or the Chagochar, they are so short, but still they contain so many ideas that are revolutionary even in today's world. So, how do you manage to pack in so much of information? Like, do you do a lot of editing, or does it all come out unconsciously?
Yeah.
That's my
No,
doubt.
see, I don't translate my own work because I feel that for to write fiction, one has to have that deep connection with the language, and my connection is only with Canada. I can't write fiction in any other language, so I can only write for my Canada readers. Having said that, I like to get involved in translation because at least I understand what is how it sounds because I have some knowledge of English. But and the reason I go to a translator is because the translator also need to have that kind of a relationship and that imagination with the language. See, that language has to be very imaginative for creative writing. And one has to capture that imagination when you translate. So, when I discuss my work with my translator, it is not about meaning of a sentence or a word or anything. It is more about what is underlying in the text, what is why certain things are said in a certain way, and why a particular word or an expression is used repeatedly, and so on and so forth. So it's actually what is underneath, what is beneath the text. So that those are the kinds of discussions that I have with my translators. And coming back to your question of brevity, I think that is my style. If you look at both these translations, every sentence in Kannada is in English. But see, in the same sentence in a language, the same sentence in Kannada, the kind of memories it evokes, it may not evoke the same memory in English. So this is where one has to be very careful in translation. And because the translation is all about bringing that unsaid from one language to the other. So it's a very complex thing. But I must tell you that everything that is in Kannada is in English, but said in a way so that it largely captures what I'm trying to say in the original.
So, how did you come up with a strong narrative of ants scrolling in Gachar Guchar? Because ants play a very important character in that story. So, how did you come up with that idea?
It's very difficult to say how you come out with that idea. It I don't know. I mean, it see when you start writing a novel, you live with that character so intensely, and the kind of space, that physical space they occupy, the mental space they occupy, and all these characters. I mean, really, when living with the characters is a very used phrase. Every writer says, I live with the characters. But it is true, one has to live with that intensity. And many people have asked me, is this your experience? But if you write with such intensity and think and capture the details of these characters and the story with that intensity, at the end of this writing, I cannot say it is not my experience. I myself have gone through it because one would have seen it in such great detail, the every minute movements, and which is why it is said that it is what I know about characters. I know probably 100, but what I have written is only 20. But you must know that other 80 to write this 20. This is that iceberg effect, which is famously known. So you write little, but you must know everything, how a character, what she or he does, how he gets up, what he does, and what he wears, and because otherwise it is not possible to achieve that brevity. Right? So there has to be a balance between, and it is possible if you know, for example, if you know a person very well, you will not start talking to that person from the beginning, right? You talk to the person with the knowledge that there is a relationship. So similar thing happens in a work. Let me read a small part in Kannada so that you know how it sounds for 2 minutes, and then we can end this conversation. This is again from Gachar Gochar. ನಮ್ಮದು ಕೂಡು ಕುಟುಂಬ. ಅಂದರೆ ನಾನು, ನನ್ನ ಹೆಂಡತಿ, ನನ್ನ ಅಪ್ಪ, ಅಮ್ಮ, ನನ್ನ ಚಿಕ್ಕಪ್ಪ ಹಾಗೂ ಮಾಲತಿ ಎಲ್ಲರೂ ಒಂದೇ ಮನೆಯಲ್ಲಿದ್ದೇವೆ. ಮಾಲತಿ ಅಂದರೆ ನನ್ನ ಅಕ್ಕ. ಅವಳು ಗಂಡನನ್ನು ಬಿಟ್ಟು ಬಂದಿದ್ದಾಳೆ. ಅವಳನ್ನು ನಾನು ಅಕ್ಕ ಅನ್ನದೇ ಮಾಲತಿ ಎಂದೇ ಹೆಸರು ಹಿಡಿದು ಕರೆಯುವುದು. ನಾವು 6 ಮಂದಿ ಯಾಕೆ ಒಟ್ಟಿಗೆ ಇದ್ದೇವೆ ಎಂಬ ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆ ಏಳುವುದು ಸಹಜ. ಅನಿವಾರ್ಯತೆಯನ್ನು ಬಯಕೆಯಂತೆ ತೋರಿಸಿಕೊಳ್ಳುವುದು ಕುಟುಂಬದ ಶಕ್ತಿಗಳಲ್ಲೊಂದು. ನನ್ನ ಚಿಕ್ಕಪ್ಪ ವೆಂಕಟಾಚಲನೇ ನಮ್ಮ ಕುಟುಂಬದ ಮುಖ್ಯ ವ್ಯಕ್ತಿ. ನಮ್ಮ ಮನೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಏಕಮಾತ್ರ ಗಳಿಕೆ ಅವನದೇ. ಅವನಿಗೆ ದುಡಿತದ ಚಟ. ಥ್ಯಾಂಕ್ ಯು.
Thank you, sir, for sharing your life journey in brief with us. Thank you for recounting your childhood days that revolved around Yakshagana and storytelling traditions, and also for sharing how your reading life evolved through all these years, on the power of rereading literature, and how all of these influenced your writing life. Sir also shared a glimpse of Yashwant Chittal's writing for us. Thank you so much, sir, for your enlightening work.